The video you are about to watch is from an old woodworking magazine that I published during the years of 2003 to approximately 2006. This was a very unique magazine. It was purely video content and it was distributed on DVDs. The magazine ran for approximately 3.5 years, and then due to financial concerns, we simply had to terminate the magazine. We moved on to other things over the last roughly 15 years. However, there has been a request to resurrect this content, so I've gone through the trouble to get the equipment, the products, everything I needed in order to bring this content back to life to share with everyone. Here on this YouTube channel, we'll be putting up approximately 100 to 120 of the original stories that appeared in that magazine. The magazine was called Woodworking at Home Magazine, and it was truly one of a kind in the world. I really hope you enjoy these videos, and please tell your friends about them. To get started on the mortising jig, I'll be working from some Baltic birch that's roughly 3/4 of an inch thick. And as with most plywoods, it's not a full 3/4 thick. Now we're also going to be using some hardwood in the construction of this jig. And that hardwood needs to be the same thickness as the plywood. So I've already gone through and planed that to its thickness. Now I'll go ahead and start ripping and cross-cutting each of the pieces for the jig. For the spacer and the mortise length adjuster, I'm using cherry for my hardwood. Now I've already planed it to the same thickness as the plywood, and now we need to rip a strip that's just a little bit bigger in diameter than the bushing we're using. Now in my case, the bushing measures out at just under 3/4 of an inch. So the piece that I want to rip has to be a little bit bigger than that, maybe about 5/1000ths of an inch or so. I've clamped together our primary base, the base plate extension, the adjuster, and our spacer. And what I'm doing is making sure that my guide bushing slides smoothly in there without any binding, and so that there is no slop. I've got a real good fit now, and so we can move on to the next step in construction. On the fence mounting plate, we're going to need to machine a slot in there. Now this piece is large enough where we could almost set it up with a router and take a series of cuts to do that. But we also need a slot on the mortise length adjuster. And this is going to be very difficult to set up and machine with a router. So I've set up the drill press with a fence and a subplate under here so I can drill through the piece. And I've set the fence distance to the center line of where I want my slot to be. And now what I'll do is I'll just drill a series of holes holding my workpiece against the fence. Now as you can see, I'm drilling between the locations where I just drilled the previous holes. Now we can go ahead and drill the slot on our adjuster. Using the same 17/64" drill bit, all I had to do was adjust everything over to line up appropriately. To hold the fence to the undersurface of our main base plate, we're going to be using a T-nut. So I have to drill through first with a 1/4 inch hole for clearance for the screw, and then I'll drill partially through for clearance on the shank or barrel diameter on the T-nut.
Now as a reminder, we don't want to drill all the way through with that 19/64" drill, just deep enough to accommodate the barrel. On the base plate extension, we need to drill a 17/64" diameter clearance hole for the tightening screw of the adjuster. Now make sure that your drill bit is perpendicular to the table as well as parallel to the faces of the board that you're drilling. I've clamped together the base plate extension to the base plate. And what I want to do is transfer the location of that hole we just drilled into the main base plate. And then we can go ahead and drill that hole further and larger to accept the threaded insert. So now by just taking our drill bit of the same diameter, I'll just move in and just lightly penetrate into our main base plate. And here you can see the little dimple we just made. And that effectively transferred the hole location from the one piece into the other. Now we can drill that for the threaded insert. The threaded insert that I'll be using requires a 5/16 diameter pilot hole to allow us to screw this into the main base plate. Now we will also have to provide a little bit of extra clearance at the bottom of the hole to allow our threaded rod to go in. Getting ready now to install the threaded insert into the main base plate. I've clamped the base plate in my bench vise and then taken a parallel clamp and clamped it tight against the plywood. Because if I just try to screw this in, there's a good chance that the plywood will split apart. I'll be using a deep wall socket along with a 1/4-20 bolt and a jam nut to help hold everything together while we tighten this in there. Out of this same cherry hardwood, we're also going to need to rip a couple of guides, and those will be a 1/4 inch thick by 1/2 inch wide. Along the bottom surface of the main base plate, we need to machine a 1/4 inch deep by 1/2 inch wide dado. That'll be 1 3/4 inches in from each edge. There will be 2 of them. With all the machining basically complete, we're getting ready now for some assembly. And you want to check to make sure that the guides that you've machined slide freely in the slots but don't have a lot of slop to them. You want to make sure that your stud that comes out for our clamp, which will hold in our adjuster, you want to make sure that all that lines up nicely and that everything will fit up good. Now we can go ahead and start assembling the jig. Getting ready now to assemble the fence to the fence mounting bracket. You'll notice that your fence is about 2 inches longer than the mounting plate. And that's so that we can clamp this onto our workpiece when using it. So I just put 2 layout marks, 1 inch in from each end. I'll put some glue on here, bring the 2 pieces together, clamp it up and set it aside to dry. Next, we need to glue the spacer between the main base plate and the base plate extension. And we want to make sure this edge lines up perfectly flush. Again, I'll just use a little bit of glue on each of those places. Now that the glue's had a chance to set up, we can move on to the next step. And that will require you to cut off a length of about 4.5 inch long of 1/4-20 threaded rod. You'll need a 1/4 inch washer and then a fixture knob. Now the length of the threaded rod you may have to adjust up or down a little bit depending on how deep in you went with your threaded insert and how thick your fixture knob is. But just simply push it in through the hole that we've drilled in the extension plate and then engage it into the threaded insert and tighten it up. You're going to need another length of threaded rod about 2.5 inches long, another fixture knob, a washer, and a 1/4-20 T-nut. And these will be used to tighten the fence in position. Now the first thing we want to do is get our T-nut mounted inside the plate. And of course, we already drilled that earlier. To install the T-nut, just place it in our counterbore hole and tap it in with a hammer. The most critical part of this step is to ensure that our fence assembly is parallel to this slot. So what we've done is we've gone through, found a scrap piece of wood that just fits inside that slot. If I slide that in there, I can tighten up my nut a little bit, and that would allow me to bring my fence up against that board, and I'll even clamp it against there to make sure that we're good and parallel to that slot. Then we can clamp our fence assembly to the base plate, and of course we'll have glue on these strips. Now, as I said, I just want a little bit of glue on there. We can actually tack these on with some brads after we get the assembly together, and the glue sets up a little bit. If you get glue out here on the base plate, clean it off. Next, I'll bring in the fence assembly in its proper orientation. I'll clamp the fence assembly to that block of wood that we slid through the slot. And now I'll put two clamps on here to hold our fence assembly down to those two guide strips. Now we'll let that sit and dry for about 15 minutes or so. Now, before that glue has a chance to completely set, I do want to remove the clamps and try and get the two pieces apart. And the reason why I don't want that glue to have a full chance to set up is because if there's any squeeze out, I could end up gluing my fence assembly right to the base plate. And look at that. Boy, sometimes you get real lucky. But I am quite sure that that glue's not had a chance to set up completely, so I'm going to be gentle with it. We'll set the base plate aside. And what I'm going to do to help hold that in place is drive in a couple of micro pin nails. And that will just help to hold everything in place while that glue finishes to set up. Then check for glue squeeze out in these areas. And if there's any there, take a sharp chisel and scrape it off. You're going to need a 3/4 inch diameter guide bushing for your router. And that, of course, fits inside the slot on the jig. Now, when you do your layouts for your mortises, you have to account for the difference between the diameter of the bit and the diameter of the bushing. Now, in this case, I'm using a 3/4 inch bushing, as mentioned, and a 3/8 inch bit. So that means my offset, or the distance between the edge of the router bit and the edge of the bushing, is 3/16 of an inch. So I have to add those layout lines as well as the layout lines for the mortise on my workpiece. Then it's just a matter of bringing the jig into alignment with those offset layout lines. This area in here is where the 3/8 inch by 2 inch long mortise needs to be machined. Then I've drawn on two additional lines 3/16 of an inch away, and that's that offset between the router bit and the guide bushing. And those are the lines that we actually line up our jig to. Now what we want to do is line up the spacer portion here with this edge of our layout mark, and then we'll adjust our fence so that this edge is perfectly even with this layout mark. And those are, of course, both the offset locations for that guide bushing and router bit difference. So we just bring it in position, slide it over, and slide it in. And that about does it. Now we'll tighten up the adjuster knob for the fence, and we can clamp the jig in place. Now we need a 2 inch long mortise at this location. So I've loosened up my adjuster, and what I want to do is bring the adjuster in and close that gap up so I've got a 2 3/8 inch opening. Once I get that lined up, tighten up the knob, and we'll double check and make sure our jig is clamped securely to the workpiece, and then we're ready for some routing. We're ready to start routing. Now, of course, you'll set your depth stops so that your router bit will cut to the appropriate depth. And in this case, I'm using a 3/8 inch solid carbide up spiral router bit, and that helps to pull the chips up out of that deep cut. Now I'll start out by plunging the router in and making a series of plunging cuts, or a drilling cut, all across the length of that mortise. Now you will have to stop frequently and vacuum out the chips. Or if your router has this nice dust evacuation port, connect your vacuum to it and then you don't have to stop. However, my vacuum hose won't fit the router. After the plunging operation, you can see how most of the material's already removed. And I did miss a little bit over on this end, so I'll go ahead and take one more plunge cut, and then we can raise the router bit up and then go down 1/4 inch or so at a time, moving back and forth, squaring up the edges. And there you have it, a nice, perfectly smooth mortise. And of course, this type of mortise is great for when using loose tenon joinery systems. So that wraps up this project of a time saver, and you've got a very handy, very easy to build, yet very accurate mortising jig for your handheld router. Thanks for watching.
I sincerely hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you truly enjoyed it, please help us share this information with the rest of the communities. Please hit the subscribe button, give us a big thumbs up, and be sure to tell your friends about this channel. Thanks again for watching.